This is a session on minimum requirements, just an overview for folks, where it comes from, why we do it, and tips for how to complete it. John already introduced the three folks that will be presenting to your day today, myself, Dan Abbe, Dan Morris, and then at the end, we've left time to have sort of a panel available to answer questions that you may have. So I just wanted to give you an idea of how the next like hour and a half will roll. I'll do an introduction and sort of the basics. Then Dan will provide sort of the regional perspective and some tips and sort of what he sees sitting at the regional level. And then the three of us together will sort of, as I said, be a panel available to answer questions and have a discussion with you guys at the end of the session. Next slide. So again, this is an introduction to minimum requirements and the MRDG, or Minimum Requirements Decision Guide. We'll get into that a little bit later. Little more formal introduction to myself. My name is Dan Abbe. I have been in the position here at Carhart since October of last year, so I'm definitely the new guy. Prior to that, I've had the pleasure and privilege of working in various areas across the country and worked with and around wilderness for the last 20 plus years. I've worked in the Northeast as well as California and Alaska. And I'm super psyched to be here with you guys. Next slide. So I did have a video. You can just skip over this one, John. Unfortunately, that had a glitch with that one. So discussion objectives for today. We'll review sort of the prohibited uses. I know a bunch of you guys, if you've been following the wilderness track early on, I think it was Ralph Swain did an introduction to the Wilderness Act, so you're probably introduced to prohibited uses if you weren't familiar with it prior to that. And then yesterday, James Simple from the BLM sort of did a deeper dive into prohibited uses and special provisions as outlined in the Wilderness Act. So it's probably going to be a review and reinforcement of that as well. And then I know James also talked about the 4 exceptions that are outlined in the Wilderness Act as well. Hopefully this will allow you to gain some understanding for minimum requirements analysis, and even more specifically, the minimum requirements decision guide as a tool to help accomplish that. And then we'll wind down the end of my presentation with sort of review of what different agency guidelines are on the use of the MRDG. So that's what we'll hopefully achieve by the end of my session. Go ahead, John. Okay, you can put it in chat. How many people have seen this before? Just yes or no. That would be great. Hopefully you have seen this before. This comes directly out of Section 4C of the Wilderness Act, and it's where we get the prohibited uses from. The Act actually calls them out. If you want to pick them all out of there, you could, but there's 10. Next slide. The 10 prohibited uses as outlined in 4C are right there. The top 2, commercial enterprises and permanent roads, are hard prohibitions. When we talk about minimum requirements analysis for those 2, that doesn't really apply, but for the other 8, that would definitely apply for our purposes. Go ahead, John, next slide. And you're just going to have to toggle through these. There you go. So the Wilderness Act basically says these are the exceptions. We're talking about those 4 exceptions we just touched on. The first one being specifically provided in the Act. So some of you familiar with the Wilderness Act, there is language in the Wilderness Act that allows the use of motorboats in wilderness areas where that use was previously existed. So that's an example of a specific prohibition that's called out in the Act itself. Subject to existing private rights. So if there's a private landowner, there's a wording to allow for some of those private rights to be maintained, even though they may not be compliant with the Wilderness Act. And then the next one, other provisions of law. ADA, the Americans Disability Act, and the use of wheelchairs in wilderness is one example of that. There's also other laws that may come into effect as well. And then number 4 is the one that we're really going to focus on, and that's the next slide. And this is the wording again that comes directly out of 4C. And then I highlighted minimum requirements there because this is where it comes from. And also in the parentheses, you'll see, including measures required by emergencies involving health and safety of persons within the wilderness. We'll come back to that in a little bit, but just want to call that out. Next slide, please. So exceptions. You can toggle through these, John. So this is where the MRA, minimum requirement analysis, comes from. This specific language, except as necessary to meet the minimum requirements. No, you're fine. That's good. So basically, that clause obligates agencies, or as this slide says, it's an implicit requirement of Section 4C that agencies basically conduct minimum requirement analysis on any prohibited use that may occur on an agency action or project within the wilderness area. So that's where the minimum requirement analysis sort of comes from. Next slide. So it's a 2-step process. Step 1, I was going to have people type in the chat. Here's step 1 is action necessary in wilderness for its administration. What do you think step number 2 is? Just throw it into chat. And don't be bashful. You guys can do it. Radio silence. Come on, someone break the silence. Well, there you go. Perfect. Go ahead, John. Click the next one. You're right. So thank you, Peter. Thank you, other folks that have responded. What is the minimum activity for achieving the objective? So if the action is necessary for the administration of the area, the next step is what is the minimum activity to achieve it? And then why should we complete an MRA? Again, I'm just going to ask you guys, sort of put it into chat. Why do you think we should be doing MRAs? You can click the first one, John. So results, transparent and defensible. It's basically documenting your decision-making process or your thought process to help you get where you're getting to a decision. Yep, I see that, David. Assess actions used minimum needs. Yep. Good. Thanks, folks. Go ahead and hit the next button. Complies with law and policy, as we already said. It's implicit in the Wilderness Act that we do it as a land management agency with wilderness responsibilities. And also our policy, our agency policy dictates that we will do it as well. Next one. Reduces cumulative impacts and inhibits decision creep. So if you're documenting what you're doing in wilderness and the actions you're taking, you're creating an administrative record, and you're basically giving yourself the institutional knowledge of what's been happening. So it does help you, people in the future, see what's been done so that it's not lost. So it helps, as it said, reduce those cumulative impacts. Next one. Discourage predetermined decisions. So this is pretty crucial. This is a process that helps you come to a decision. The assumption all along is that a decision has not yet been made. So this process helps discourage predetermined decisions. Next one. And it preserves wilderness character. You guys have probably heard a lot about wilderness character this week, and it's crucial that this process, the way it's designed, is to help managers and stewards ensure that they're preserving wilderness character for the long term. All right, next slide. So why should we complete an MRA? Again, in the chat, or excuse me, when should we complete an MRA? If folks would throw in the chat, when do you think you need to do an MRA? And just hit the first one, John. Let people. Resource management and restoration activities. So if you have a proposed action that's going to involve one of the prohibitions, one of those 8 related to resource management and restoration, or I would even say if you have one that may have an impact on wilderness character, regardless of using the prohibitions, you might want to do that. When conducting an action is prohibited. Yep. All right. Anybody else want to throw something in chat? I do like that, Kara, before any action is taken. There's a strong argument for that in invasive species management. Excellent. Thank you, Stephen. Go ahead and hit the next one, John. Scientific monitoring and research. So, you know, the Wilderness Act does call out that one of the purposes of wilderness is for science. So we do allow science and research in wilderness, but it's not carte blanche. We still need to go through this process. Search and rescue protocols. Thank you, David. Go ahead, hit the next one. Search and rescue will come up again because we approach that a little bit differently. We still go through the process, but we'll talk about that a little bit more. Trails and other recreational developments. Next one. Special provisions in existing valid rights. So even if someone has private land surrounded by wilderness and historically they have used a trail to access their property, the agency would need to evaluate any proposal by the landowner on improved access to that land. So that would be one example to that. Next one. Emergencies. So we mentioned this before a couple of times. It says programmatically in advance. So what the best management practices for dealing with emergencies and conducting an MRA that addresses emergency use of prohibited activities or prohibited prohibitions in wilderness is done proactively in advance with the emergency services providers in that area. And what that would basically look like is an opportunity to reach out to those folks, explain your obligations under the Wilderness Act, as well as your land management plan, and basically develop a programmatic MRA that spells out what would be approved for a given situation. Thanks, John. Next slide. So someone touched on this earlier. Anytime there's an action in wilderness, we'll even put a little more specifically whenever wilderness character might be affected, which may be any action that occurs from a management perspective. Next slide. So the minimum requirements decision guide. So it's a process to help you achieve the MRA. And it was developed by the Arthur Carhart National Wilderness Training Center and interagency training. So all four federal land management agencies that steward wilderness were involved in its development. And it's a guide to help folks, as I said, work through that process. Next slide. Again, it's a two-step process. Imagine that. Step one is the action necessary in wilderness. That should look familiar. Hopefully everybody's seen that. And then step two, again, what is the minimum to achieve that objective or that action? Super. Thanks. Next slide. We're going to try to do this sort of on the fly, but at one point during the presentation, I'm going to ask John, actually, since he's sharing his screen, if he can navigate to WildernessConnect, and we're actually going to go look at a case study. But these are some great resources for folks. Wilderness.net, also known as WildernessConnect. If you go on there, hit the practitioners tab and work your way to the MRA page, you'll find a plethora of resources that will help you out. So these are some of the things that you would find there. Go ahead, John. So if we were to work our way through the MRDG, in step 1, we need to determine, is action necessary? So this process, basically the first part of it is describing the situation. And go ahead and click on the next button. And when we describe the situation, we're only talking about the current situation. What is the situation that you are facing in the field? We're not going to talk about solutions or proposals or what we want to do. We're just laying out basically the foundation of this is what is happening in the field. Next slide, or next button. So when we talk about the description, the next thing that it'll ask us for in the MRDG is, are there options outside of wilderness? Next button. And guess what? If there's options outside of wilderness, we're done. But it's not quite that easy. So next slide. If there are no options outside of wilderness and we need to proceed, are there valid existing rights, VER, or special provisions that provide direction on how to address the situation? And as you can see, legal rights that compel action, explicit provisions, or other needs associated with valid existing rights. Next slide. Still in step 1, we're also looking at other federal legislation. So we talked about this earlier on, the ADA, American Disabilities Act. Does it provide any specific guidance? Or there may be other laws, let's say the Endangered Species Act. So there might be other federal legislation that provide direction. And then also, when we're describing the current situation, we're also going to talk about what the impacts to wilderness character are. And you'll see it says use the definitions in KIW2, which is Keep It Wild 2. That's a document that's also found on WildernessConnect. It provides concise definitions on the different qualities of wilderness character, because it does get confusing, especially if you're not familiar with the definitions as explained in Keeping It Wild 2. And then you're also, when you're talking about the impacts to wilderness character, it says material threats to those qualities. So we can move to the next slide. So step 1, determination. And again, as you're working through this, the MRDG, you'll get to this point, and the determination will be whether or not the action has to happen in wilderness. And if the answer is no, we're done. You do not proceed. But if the answer is yes, then we need to move to step 2 to determine what the minimum action is. So go to the next slide. So the minimum activity, you can just run down through it right there. You're looking for other direction that basically directs you to take action, whether that's a federal or state law, agency policy, or your site management plans, whether it's a park or forest management plan, or your overarching general land use management plan, and also the local wilderness or wilderness stewardship plan for that area. Next. Still under the next part of it is, are there time constraints? So if the action were to take place, are you restricted because of seasonality? Are you restricted because wildlife limitations, as it says there, breeding or nesting seasons? Is it a hazardous condition that you need to wait out? Or is there a risk of a catastrophic event, so you need to take immediate action? Next slide. And you're going to sort of outline the components of the action. Next slide. And the components of the action, you want to break it down into what are logical phases or stages. So how are you going to achieve the action you're proposing? Usually there's going to be some fairly logical components to achieving it. And when I show you the example, hopefully that'll make more sense. Go ahead, next. Then you're going to describe, you're going to provide a description of your alternatives. So you're probably going to have a full range of alternatives. There may be 2 or 3, or there may be more. And then you're going to describe what the components are in each one of those alternatives, and they may vary. So that's why you see that arrow going up and down. It's sort of an iterative process. As you're thinking of alternatives, you may add or delete components for that given alternative. And you need to determine that they're feasible and effective. And then also you're going to describe mitigation measures. Next slide. I think you have to hit one more. Okay. And then we already talked about this. It means of accomplishing each one of the components, and that activities may vary according to the alternative. Go ahead and go to the next slide, please. Component activities, hit the next. And again, you're also, for each one of your alternatives, you're going to address the impacts to the different qualities of wilderness character. And these are both quantitative and qualitative. So there's a positive and a negative, as well as a numerical score in the MRDG. We'll talk a little bit more, and we'll show you in the example as well. But one of the potential flaws in the MRDG is that all effects are presumed to be equal. And so you really need to describe or elaborate if you feel one impact is going to outweigh the others. Okay. And then you're also going to sort of highlight some of the alternatives that you may have discussed, but you decided not to analyze them, not to put any effort into determining whether or not they were a viable alternative. And basically for those reasons, it's ineffective, infeasible, it's not safe, or it doesn't address the objectives of your action. And I do see a comment about keeping it wild too. We'll show you, it is on WildernessConnect, and if you can shoot me an email, I can definitely get it to you. But all right, so the last part of the MRDG process provides a comparison. And the current version was developed in 2016. And at the time there was thinking that basically to help decision makers do a better job of comparing the analysis or the alternatives, that having a quantitative rating, i.e. a numerical rating, was helpful. Since then, we've decided that probably that's not what's happening. And there's a strong possibility with that quantitative element may end up being dropped in the future. But again, we'll run through the example, and I'll show you elaborate on that a little bit. So we're almost done. So to sort of finish up with your process, you've determined that the action is in wilderness and it is, you have to do something. You're going to provide a description of which alternative you've selected and the rationale behind it. And especially if it turns out that you're selecting an alternative that may provide a numerical score that's different than what appears to be the desired choice. And that's one of the downfalls with the current system. Again, when we get to the example, I'll sort of highlight that. Next slide. So the take home for the step 2 determination is you definitely want to make sure that the decision is whatever is best preserving and protecting and enhancing wilderness character is the one that's being selected. So with that, and thank you, David Cohen, just put the link to the Keeping It Wild 2 in the chat box for folks. Go ahead and hit your next button. So I don't know if we can do this real quick, John, or not. Can you actually, instead of sharing the PowerPoint, can you navigate to WildernessConnect, wilderness.net, and put that up on the screen?
Can you see it? It's there.
We're still showing the PowerPoint. And if not, we can go back to the PowerPoint, we'll run through it, and then we'll go to the example. So agency guidance on the MRDG, the Minimum Requirement Decision Guide. We'll go over this pretty quickly. The BLM does require the use of the MRDG. And then you can see, as far as approval authority, that's what's down below. Approved by the state directors, but authority can be delegated down. So for the Fish and Wildlife Service, by agency policy, they require an MRA to be completed. However, they don't require the use of the MRDG. They recommend its use. And again, approvals at the refuge manager or supervisor's level or those above. Next slide. For the National Park Service, similar to Fish and Wildlife, MRA is required, as you can see there. And again, they recommend the use of the MRDG, but they don't require the use of the MRDG. And there's approvals. Next slide. And then the Forest Service, I'm going to put a caveat in here. The MRDG is required. As far as I know, all the regional foresters require the use of the MRDG. So that's why that I put a caveat on that. It's crucial if you do work for the Forest Service that you reach out to your local wilderness specialist on your forest or whoever has those responsibilities. And then you also have your regional program managers, of which with us today are Dan and John, who can help you out with that as well. And then I think the last slide. And it's a pretty dry topic, but it actually is intriguing for some folks like myself, but I just want to leave you with a little thought. If you feel like you're being part of the bureaucracy and that's getting you a little bit frustrated, take some advice from Edward Abbe. And now, John, if you can, I'm also seeing a comment in the chat from Peter Molly. BLM guidance also calls for using the MRDG for non-prohibited activities that could impact wilderness character. Super, thank you for that. So hopefully this will look familiar. This is basically probably the most extensive repository of wilderness related information out there right now, and it's both for the general public as well as for practitioners. Dan's going to take you to the practitioners page. And then if you look right in the middle, you'll see minimum requirements. Click on that. And then you can click on either up or in the left, you'll see minimum requirement decision guide, or you can see it in the body of the narrative, either one. But if you click on either one of those, and this basically, like I said, it was the last revision was 2016. And Dan, if you could just scroll down slowly. The process outline is a very helpful document. Actually, all of these are extremely helpful. And then the two workbooks, there's a workbook in Excel format and there's one in the Word format. Dan will probably reaffirm this, but most folks in the field at this point are using the Word document, not the Excel. And then you can see below that agency guidelines, it sort of spells that out. And then if you go a little bit further down, Dan, and you click on the historic cabin, so you can see case study examples. So this is a document that basically is an example of the MRDG and provides you what it would look like. So again, we talked about description of the situation. If you were to read through the description, it basically provides you just a snapshot of what they're being confronted with, which is basically they have a historic cabin that because of legal obligations and policy, they need to do something about. So I just let you guys read that for a second. And you can basically see in the second paragraph, the State Historical Preservation Office, so SHPO was involved. So remember, we talk about, does the state have some role or provide some guidance? This is an example of that. You scroll down a little bit, Dan. Okay, and there's the first question. Options outside of wilderness? No. And then it asks you to explain why. And this is pretty clear. The cabin sits in designated wilderness. So, and then is action necessary to meet any criteria as far as for a special provisions? And the answer is no. You can scroll down some more. And the guide is basically just going to walk you through a couple of different check boxes, and then it asks you to explain. So requirements of other legislation. So this is where the box is checked yes, and you can see they highlighted all the other legal obligations that they have to do something with this cabin. So that would be an example of that. And then they also talk about the impacts to wilderness character with the current situation. And you'll basically see they check a box, whether it's yes or no, and then they provide some type of explanation. Okay, you can keep scrolling down, Dan. Undeveloped, natural, same thing. They're checking a box and providing an explanation. Solitude and unconfined recreation, outstanding features of value. So this one's checked yet, or excuse me, other features of value. So this one's checked yes, and this one's worth looking at because you can see they actually quote the Wilderness Act. And they tell you why action is needed in wilderness because of this other value that's been identified. Okay, you scroll down a little bit, Dan. And then step one, determination. So is administrative action necessary in wilderness? You can see they check the box, yes. And then there's an explanation. And this one's pretty concise. So they made the determination that some action needs to happen in wilderness. So now you'll start to see that they develop their alternatives. So go ahead and scroll down. Before they do the alternatives, you'll see this description that they provide, basically outlining, again, why they need to do something. Let me go ahead, scroll down, Dan. Talk about time constraints, and then they talk about the components. So these would be all components that may be associated with the action. And then they're going to develop, in this particular case, they develop 3 alternatives. And Dan, just to save a little bit of time here, you can just see that here's alternative 1. Provide necessary maintenance to stabilize, use helicopters. Then there's an alternative 2. And each alternative, they sort of have to run through what the impacts are to the qualities of wilderness character. And you'll see them do that. And then Dan, just to sort of move along so we can get to you, go scroll down to the comparisons, which would be a little bit further down. There's alternative 2. Alternative 3. And then the last part of it, after they've developed their alternatives, they talk about alternatives that weren't seriously considered, and then they do a comparison. And you should see it. So this is the alternative comparison, and you can see alternative 1, 2, and 3 have a numerical score. But again, as I said earlier, it's this quantitative analysis doesn't really address how impacts may be greater or lesser to a given quality of wilderness, given quality within the wilderness character. So it can be misleading, but you can see they end up coming up with their decision down below. Explanation and rationale for selection. So they selected a given alternative, but then they also talk about the other alternatives. And this is where whichever selection you make, you need to make that justification for why it does the best job of protecting overall wilderness character. Your rationale for making your decision. So that, thank you very much, Dan, I appreciate it. That's sort of an overview of the MRA process, and then the use of the tool, the MRDG, to help accomplish that. I apologize, I was having computer issues, but with that, I think we're going to transition over to Dan, and Dan's going to, like I said, give everybody sort of that regional perspective, as well as some tips on how to complete MRAs. Thank you very much.
All right, great. Thanks, Dan. Yeah, that was a good overview for sure. And yeah, so I'm gonna actually look at some information on wilderness.net, WildernessConnect as well. There's some good documents there that look at some of the common pitfalls. And I'm going to go into at least the Region 4 Intermountain region process we use, which I believe is probably similar throughout the Forest Service and to some extent perhaps similar to other agencies. Going to look or just kind of touch on some of the common projects we see in Region 4 and across the Forest Service anyway, and probably similar with other agencies as well. And then I'm going to go through a real life minimum requirements analysis, and if time is permitting, probably in some detail. And this is one that's kind of in process. So hopefully that'll be a useful tool to see how this process is used for an actual project. So all right, I'm going to share All right, so we are back on Wilderness Connect, the main, introduction here. And Dan went through this already pretty thoroughly. And yeah, there is a workbook format in Excel and in Word. Just a couple things to note. The Excel format does not have a built-in spell check. So just that's something to be aware of, especially if you're a average speller like myself. So there's no built-in grammar police with that. The Excel can be really useful for those pretty straightforward projects where you might not need a whole bunch of analysis. But yeah, in most cases, I do recommend the Word format. One advantage of the Excel is it does pre-populate a lot of the information throughout the alternative, so that makes it easy to use in some respects. All right, so I'm going to scroll down here under the Forest Service guidelines. We have this FAQs and common errors document. There we go. And this is pretty handy, and it kind of does go through some questions you might have. And yeah, just talks about the basics, relationship with NEPA, which is important to understand. But I'm going to jump ahead to Arthur Carhart's top 10 list here. And some of the common errors we see. And this first one, written to support a predetermined action. So it's kind of predecisional, is quite common, at least in my region. Seems like we're getting better and better here, but you will see this in cases where a project that's maybe from another resource. A good example is treating invasive plants. They'll have a forest-wide EIS to consider, options for treating invasive plants, and then maybe toward the end they're like, oh yeah, in wilderness we want to do this work as well, and all of a sudden they need to do this minimum requirements process. So ideally we're doing this process before NEPA, and it helps inform the NEPA process. All right, action is not broken down into its discrete components. And when we go through this case study I have, that'll be a little clearer, but you want to analyze each part of the action. So getting the crew into wilderness, getting supplies into wilderness, doing the actual work, getting crew and supplies out of wilderness. Are kind of your very basic components you want to address. Each of those components may have a specific effect to wilderness character that you want to be able to look at. All right, bias statements, especially we'll have projects that there's a proponent, maybe a state fish and wildlife agency that wants to study wildlife within the wilderness. And often they will take a crack at doing a minimum requirements analysis. So you'll see some predecisional and some biased language in situations like that you just need to clean up. And then, yeah, here's a common one, number 4. how do we address motorized use? Is it a form of development? Which in most cases, yes, we want to look at it like that. Often you'll see it addressed under solitude as well. So just something to be aware of. You want to be consistent within your document. So you're looking at all your alternatives consistently. Untrammeled, I think folks are getting better and better at understanding what untrammeled is. But you'll see this sort of intertwined with undeveloped a little bit. So just keep a lookout for making sure we're addressing untrammeled correctly. And a lot of times you'll see people thinking any action is a trammeling, any action within wilderness is a trammeling. And that's not always the case. A trammel is some intentional attempt to manipulate is generally how I like to look at it. All right. Did not account for real cost savings. We no longer really look at cost, but sometimes that will pop up in a alternative not considered. It was cost prohibitive because of whatever reasons. Which very well may be the case, but make sure that is accurate. And if you're gonna go that route and throw out an alternative because of cost, make sure you're accurately looking at the costs of those alternatives you are considering as well. Complete range of alternatives not considered. So this is an important one. And these 4 are the ones that we typically want to make sure we at least think about. An alternative that considers prohibited uses, one that considers no prohibited uses, one that is a blend, as well as a no action alternative. And there may be cases where you don't do one that uses all prohibited uses because you can get it done with a blend, and that's fine. You don't need to go through the hoops of doing all prohibited uses just for the sake of doing that. It is important in most cases to have a no action to kind of have that baseline, similar to NEPA. But there are cases where a no action is not appropriate, and the case we're going to take a look at is one of those. All right, moving on down. And these are a couple common ones where in step 1, we're supposed to just spell out the situation. And you'll see oftentimes folks will get into the need for action or even starting to analyze a certain alternative. But we want to keep all that out of this step 1. We're just spelling out the situation. All right. Number 9 there. Trying to find my cursor. There we go. Just because a prohibited use is allowable doesn't mean it's not necessary. So that's where we want to really look at our enabling legislation. There's a big difference between shall and may. All right, and then that last one, again, kind of what I was talking about, that description of the situation in step 1 starts to jump ahead to one of the alternatives or to one of the potential solutions. So those are just some common items to look out for. All right. And I'm going to also, while I'm here in wilderness.net, point out these training courses. So these are really, really helpful. And there's one about writing an MRA, one about evaluating an MRA. And both of those are really helpful for anyone that actually works with a minimum requirements analysis. All right. So I'm gonna stop sharing that. And just briefly talk about some of the common projects that I see in Region 4. And John, if there's something that pops up in chat that's worth interrupting me about, please feel free to do that. So
There's maybe one question, but we'll hold off until you're done and just keep it part of the larger Q&A at the end.
Okay, perfect. All right, so we see some pretty straightforward ones like bridge replacements. Sometimes trail maintenance where we're looking at a pretty big project where we might want to consider using a power drill, or even chainsaws. We hear about that some. Kind of like the example Dan touched on, addressing a historical cabin. We see a few of those historical structures, treating invasive plants. We see a lot of native fish recovery projects, native cutthroat trout, where the state wildlife agency, working with our internal fish biologists, wants to treat a stream to get rid of non-natives and then potentially transplant native fish back into the wilderness. And those are pretty complex, and hopefully there's a NEPA component with projects of that scale. Also, we see wildlife studies. The State Fish and Wildlife Agency wants to study native bighorn sheep. They want to collar them, kind of find out where they're going. Are they interacting with domestic livestock, which potentially might transmit disease? And often there's a helicopter use component with those type of projects. And again, a pretty big deal, pretty complex. We do need the appropriate level of NEPA with those. So those are just a few of our more common projects that I see. All right. Then I'm going to talk just a little bit about the process we use in Region 4. And, I really like to, and I find we have things go smoother if I'm involved early on in the process. So, I've tried to communicate that yeah, if you're thinking about something that might require an MRA, touch base with me. Let's talk through it. Before we get to, ready to brief the regional forester. So kind of our process generally, on the district and forest level, folks will start to do a first draft of a minimum requirements analysis. And again, if I can be involved early, I can identify some pitfalls, or maybe we can talk through step one and be like, hey, actually we can address this challenge outside wilderness. And we don't need to go through a whole bunch of hoops first. What I hate to see is I get a polished up document with the forest supervisor's signature, and we need the regional forester to approve in 2 weeks. So, often there's some things we need to address before we get to that level. And then also if I get to see it early on in the process, especially for a project like data fish recovery, I can tie in with my counterparts in those resources in the region, say, hey, are you aware of this? And they often will have some good input as well. So there's usually some discussion and back and forth. I'll have some edits and comments. We'll, maybe have a conference call or a Teams meeting to discuss those. Once we feel good about it, the forest will have the forest supervisor sign that recommendation. Comes back to me to try to find a time to brief the corner office. In our region, it's usually a deputy regional forester that I brief, and they will approve or not for the regional forester. That may be a little different elsewhere or in other agencies. And then if it's a project that has an outside entity doing some action, like a, State Fish and Wildlife Agency, we'll usually do a letter, a formal letter. I think some regions, they'll do a formal letter with most projects. If it's just internal, I don't always do that from the region. We just do our approval of that prohibited use or approval of that MRA. But again, yeah, check with your regional program manager to make sure you're following that regional process. All right, and yeah, that whole process can take some time, a month, maybe a little more, depending on the level of complexity. And it does take, at least a couple of weeks to book time with the regional forester. So just be aware that we're not going to be able to turn on a dime to approve these projects, which is a good thing. We want to really make sure we're doing right by wilderness. We're looking at, is this the best thing for wilderness character? Is it the minimum necessary? All right. So with that, I'm going to jump into an example here. Upper South Teton Bridge replacement in the Jedediah Smith Wilderness on the Caribou-Targhee National Forest. And we're kind of in our process of some back and forth with me giving the forest some edits. Step one, like Dan went over, is the action necessary. And they did a pretty good job with this one. They used a similar project on the neighboring forest as kind of a template, which is always great. You don't need to reinvent the wheel on these, but do make sure it is specific to your project. And they did a pretty good job here. They just talk about, yeah, we have this bridge on a certain trail. Our engineers have told us that it needs replaced. It's no longer safe. So right there, they have some need for action. They didn't get into different alternatives, which is pretty good. All right, and I'm going to go through this fairly quick, but hopefully not too quick here. So options outside of wilderness. This bridge is located in wilderness. That's pretty straightforward. There's no other legislation or special provisions that require us to act. So we have to fall back to, is there a component of wilderness character that makes it necessary to act? So untrammeled, we don't need to do this to protect untrammeled, don't need to do anything to protect undeveloped, but natural is where they're placing their argument. And so this is a busy trail, lots of people, going up and down this trail. It accesses Teton National Park. So, you know, they're saying that if we don't have a bridge here, we're going to get a bunch of social trails, we're going to get some resource damage. The bridge will actually help us address that effect to natural quality. So with each project, you just kind of have to weigh that out and provide that rationale. All right. So moving on down, yeah, their need for action is to preserve natural quality. All right, and so this other description or other direction category, it's good. One of the common errors, we'll see this just filled with tons of stuff. You know, you don't need to put every little piece of direction that might support doing this project. But they have some information specific to bridges in their forest plan, which they put in here, some manual direction. Well, you'll see they did put in here national bridge training, design permanent trail bridges to last 50 years and withstand a 100-year flood. So I highlighted that, and let's see, I intended to have a comment in here, but so, you know, I'm going to go back and say, hey, is there some actual direction here? You know, or is this just something that was mentioned in a training? So I had a question about that. It's probably something we don't need to put in here, but if there is some actual direction, then maybe we can. All right. And then, oops, sorry. Our components of the action here. They've done a good job of breaking this down. Transportation of components and tools into the wilderness, bridge construction, bridge removal, transportation out of the wilderness, as well as transportation of people and supplies, and camping at the project site. So they probably have covered every component of the action there. You know, so this one, you just want to be thoughtful. You know, you don't need every single tiny little action in here, but on the flip side, you don't want to lump too much. Okay. All right, so into their alternatives. Alternative one is dismantle the old bridge and pack out any non-native material without bridge replacement. So in this project, we did not do a no action, mainly because we didn't really think it's an acceptable action to leave the old bridge just sitting there, since it's been determined to be unsafe. And you know, so this kind of takes, to some extent, a place of our no action alternative. All right, and they do a good job of concisely explaining the alternative there. You know, they're gonna not use any motorized equipment or mechanized transport. They're gonna dismantle the old bridge and pack it out under this alternative. All right, and then you'll see the components of the action on this right side column. They kind of speak to what is happening specific to this alternative. Right, so those items are going to end up being what we analyze those actions for effects to wilderness character down below. All right, so is there an effect to untrammeled? You know, probably not. Yeah, we're taking an action, removing an old bridge, you know, but we're not intentionally trying to manipulate the stream or, you know, manipulate natural processes here. So don't think there's an effect on untrammeled. All right, undeveloped. So here they showed no effect. And, you know, I posed the question, well, is there maybe a positive effect to undeveloped by removing that old bridge? So that's something we'll discuss there. You know, I think there potentially is that positive effect. All right, bouncing down to natural. So they're saying that because they are just pulling out the old bridge, not replacing the new bridge under this alternative, there's going to be a potential negative effect to natural quality. And that's where they get to stream bank will be subject to erosion and sedimentation as people are going to wander around looking for a way to get across the stream. And you know, those of us that have worked or been in wilderness, you'll see this. You know, if you come to a crossing without a bridge, especially if it's a busy trail, you'll see social trails going both ways, looking for an appropriate way to get across. Okay, solitude or primitive and unconfined recreation. So they put that positive effect of removing the bridge in here. So this is kind of a common, you know, something we have to think about. Is that presence of that old bridge, is it an effect to your solitude, or is it an effect to undeveloped quality? So, you know, I think you can go either way. I tend, with a bridge, you know, tend to think of that as a development. But the main thing is be consistent throughout the document. And, you know, they had a minus here, so I wasn't sure if that was left over from another document or if they actually, you know, wanted to talk about the presence of the crew dismantling this bridge being a potential negative to solitude. So that's something we'll have to discuss. All right, moving down. Hopefully the rapid scrolling isn't giving anyone vertigo. All right, so alternative 2 is replacing the bridge using motorized and non-motorized means. So alternative 2 is using a helicopter to bring in a new stringer bridge or components of a new stringer bridge that will be assembled at location. So yeah, using a helicopter, we're going to have some obvious effects to wilderness character there. They're not going to land, but they are going to sling load those components down and then construct on site. All right, and again, you see they've done a pretty good job of breaking out those component actions. And let's get into the effects to wilderness character. So we have no effect for untrammeled. Yes, we're taking action, but we're, you know, replacing an existing bridge. You know, I would agree. We aren't intentionally trying to manipulate natural processes here. Undeveloped, they put a negative effect. That's probably appropriate. You know, the use of the helicopter, use of motorized transport. And they did not put a negative effect just by replacing the bridge. And the assumption there is we already had a bridge, we're just replacing it. There's not a new effect to undeveloped. All right. I want to leave plenty of time for Q&A, so we're going to breeze through the rest of this, but they're claiming a positive effect to natural. Putting in that bridge will ensure that we don't have stream bank erosion from folks trying to ford and find an alternative crossing somewhere up or downstream. All right, solitude, we don't have any effects here. You know, and I just pose the question, you know, make sure we're consistent between alternatives. If you remember, they had that kind of stray negative effect in that previous alternative. All right, and so we only deeply analyzed 2 alternatives there. So, you know, that's a fair question. Is that enough? Do we need to analyze a different type of bridge or using native materials or something else? And so they, you know, didn't analyze those in detail, but they did a pretty good job of showing that, yeah, we considered some other alternatives and here's why we're not using those. So yeah, I won't discuss this too deeply, but you don't want to just baselessly take out an alternative. You want to make sure you know, explain why you're not addressing that other alternative in detail. All right, and the one, you know, that, you know, that you want to really think about is, you know, why not use native materials? Why not, you know, use, you know, some natural stringers from on-site logs? And, you know, it's pretty common, you know, the span of the bridge, you know, necessitates that, you know, we can't really find those on site, you know, can't find appropriate materials on site. So we ended up with just 2 alternatives. Again, you want to, with a Word document, it doesn't pre-populate. So you want to make sure you're consistent with what you set up above. And then we jump into the determination. Here we're leaning on replacing that bridge. You know, and we speak to, yeah, we're going to have some obvious effects by using a helicopter. However, in the long term, we think this better preserves wilderness character by preserving that natural quality of wilderness character. So hopefully that was kind of helpful to go through a real world example. And then just the last part, I'll go through. We usually want to have prepared by, you know, whoever put it together. And it looks like we're naming names here. So, and then the recommended section for us, the bare minimum is recommended by the forest supervisor and myself. You can put other folks in here if you want. And then the approval is the regional forester. All right, so that's all I have. So I will stop sharing and turn it back over to John. And I think we've got a general Q&A coming up next.
Yeah, and if folks, if you need to stand up, take a break. stretch for 1 second. I've got about 2 questions in the chat that we'll start off with here. And why folks are stretching, maybe Dan can address this first one. I can maybe chime in as well, or anybody else can too. So Dan A, back during your presentation and what the agency requirements are, there was a question about the Forest Service requirements and a comment that the USF policy does not require an MRDG. And I know we can go into the details of this. It just requires an MRA. And, you know, there's a often referred to chief's memo about that. What I tell forests, and you can please expound upon this, is that the MRDG has become the standard documentation when you are requesting regional forester approval for a certain type of project. It's not required, but it's going to make your process a lot easier at this point. So I'll let you expand on that if you can.
Sure. So thanks. And also, I need to acknowledge much of the content for the presentation I provided was provided by Ken Straley, who was my predecessor and who's actually on the meeting today, so he can chime in if he wants. But there is no national policy requiring the use of an MRDG within the Forest Service. I tried to put that caveat in, basically saying that regional foresters have made that requirement in some regions. And as you said, and Dan Morris, you can jump in as well, it is the best template to use currently. It's sort of the gold standard for an MRA. So, and for the reasons that we discussed earlier. So you'll hear some people refer to the fact that the Forest Service has an administrative requirement to do an MRDG. There's some truth to that. But as far as a specific policy mandating it at the national level, that observation was correct. The Forest Service does not require the use of an MRDG at the national level.
Yeah, and yeah, exactly right. I'll just chime in. I was asked once to write an MRA not using the format. So that does happen, but you still have to do a minimum requirements analysis. All those, you know, components, is the action necessary, you know, everything you need to look at. So the MRDG is a really good tool for that. So yeah, I tried to push back on that, but I ended up writing a Word document that, you know, basically mimicked the MRDG. So.
Well, and a lot of MRDGs that are coming in these days are a little more complex than just approving, you know, use of a chainsaw or something like that. They're much more complex with restoration and other, you know, unique activities. And sometimes the format of the MRDG does not lend itself well to analysis of those. In particular, step 2 with the quantitative monitor or the quantitative scoring. And I did one in the southern region where I eliminated the quantitative portion because it just didn't make sense. I was like, we need a qualitative discussion on this, and we just we modified the form for that particular one. And yeah, it worked out well where you're discussing the impacts to each character, you know, with descriptions as opposed to a +1 or a -1. So it was helpful. I wanted to throw out kind of comment number 2, not particularly, it is a question, but if anybody on the call is aware of any MRDGs that address designated campsites or establishing buffer zones, camping zones, camping permits, designated sites, anything like that. And Eric, I've put out a feeler to a few folks already, and I haven't had any takes, but if you are aware of anything like that, please send it to myself or Eric Dodd on the Daniel Boone National Forest.
Hey, John and Eric. So real quick, I know White Mountain National Forest in New Hampshire 13 Mile Creek, they had some tent sites. I think they were working through an MRDG on. So you might
What was
want,
what was the location again?
I think it's, I want to say 13 Mile Creek, but I could be wrong on that.
Oh, what forest?
It's White Mountain National Forest.
Gotcha.
And person to reach out to there, the supervisor's office person in charge of recreation is Mary Ann Lieberman. So she might be a good person to, oh, Kristen Bailey just put it in. It's 13 Falls. Thank you,
Okay.
Kristen.
I'm sure myself or I'll talk with Eric and we'll reach out and see if there's some resources they have that would help with their particular project. The next question in the chat, I'm going to read this word for word, and I might need Kara for you to expand upon this. Have there been any analyses of MRDGs that indicate any trends in the decision that is reached through the process? And I'm not sure I can summarize that one. I'm missing a little information there and not understanding the question properly. Kara, feel free to come off mute, and we're happy to have a conversation. I'm sure we can do that.
Yeah, I mean, my question is not like because I think that would be like helpful for guiding like any sort of decision making in terms of like individual MRDGs, but I'm curious if there's been any analysis of like macro trends of the MRDG process to see if like there are any trends in like the outcome that is eventually reached through that process, because I think that having an understanding of that could reveal potentially like some previously unknown biases in decision making regarding management decisions. So that's kind of where my question is coming from, if that helps.
No, that definitely helps. And I'll maybe just start first. I'm not aware of any kind of research or kind of a study that looks at bigger picture MRDG decisions. I know per wilderness area, you can kind of track, what decisions have been made and what actions have been authorized in that particular wilderness. That's maybe shifting into wilderness character monitoring, but also seeing these bigger picture trends. I've got some wildernesses that don't have anything in there because they're not authorizing anything, and others that have a very active search and rescue program and or have other projects that they're working on. So I know there is something at a wilderness level, but I don't know about bigger picture. Dan, are you aware?
I just saw Dusty came in the room, but you sort of hit on it, John. I think wilderness character monitoring would get at that maybe in a roundabout way, and maybe even WSP, but it made me smile because I thought, what a great graduate thesis that would be, is to just look at either a region or even one or two wilderness areas and go look through their historic MRDGs or MRAs and see if you could pull anything out of there in relation to trends. But to my knowledge, no. The simple answer to your question is I'm unaware of any attempt to use that and the MRAs to track trends and decisions.
Right, and Ken just put in the chat as well. He knows of one done by Leopold a few years ago, trying to assess the trend in ecological intervention decisions specifically, but probably not bigger picture. So, and Dusty, I saw your question. If there's ever been a study since you just joined, looking at any trends in MRDG decision making. What's been done large picture, not just per wilderness, but the actual process and the decision-making process of MRDGs as a whole. So,
not that I'm familiar with. Ken Straley may know.
He said Leopold did one on ecological intervention, okay. But I don't think there is one out there. And Kara, I bet if we just had Jason Taylor with Leopold on earlier today, and they have a really good website where you probably could see if you could find that report, and maybe one of us can try to track that down as well. Quick question just to follow up. MRAs or MRDGs are not needed for basic trail maintenance, correct? The answer to that one is correct. For basic trail maintenance, you do not need an MRA. Let's see. And then I think Stephen was following up on Kara's question. Could WCM baselines provide some info for MRDG trends? I think as you're looking at those agency management actions and tracking some of those things, I think that could be built into there. And I think it is, to be honest with you, but I'd want to defer to maybe someone a little more knowledgeable on that particular measure within wilderness character monitoring. I think I addressed all the questions. So anyone else, feel free to put something in the chat or come off mute. I was going to make one comment about some recommendations. We've talked about the no action alternative a lot in MRDGs. A lot of times, depending on the project, I'll recommend to the forests I work with doing those is to not have a no action alternative, especially if they're struggling to do a good analysis, I guess, because if you've made it past step one, you've kind of determined that action is needed. Now, if you only have one option, like with yours, Dan, where there really was, maybe it's kind of do it or don't do it, and how we're going to do it. Those cases are there. But if I'm trying to push someone to develop some true alternatives, I'll say don't do a no action, because you're going to do something in most cases. So let me go back to the chat really quick. No silly questions, Christina, but I am new to the wilderness world, and I'm still a little confused why we would require an MRA for scientific research if that research didn't involve any of the 10 prohibited uses. You want to start with that one, Dan?
Which Dan?
Either one.
So you've got a good point. However, what it comes down to, I think, for most agencies is there an impact to the wilderness character of the area by the research? So if the research is basically doing observation where there's none of the prohibited uses being attached and there's going to be no impact to recreational users, then the agency would probably make the decision to approve or disapprove it without the use of an MRA. But I guess one of the caveats that I put on things is anytime you're proposing to do anything in wilderness, this question should pop into your mind first and foremost. Do I need to do an MRA, or what do I need to do? So with that in mind, I know some agencies too have sort of tried to streamline the process to help researchers determine whether or not they need to do an MRA. And I'll leave it at that and let Dan or John add on to it.
Yeah, and Ken Straley just added a document in the chat that can kind of help identify, if you should consider a MRA. And kind of like Dan said, even if we don't need to do an MRA, because there's no prohibited use, it's good to go through the thought process and kind of think about, is there an effect to wilderness character? What is the benefit, to wilderness character? So just, if there was a research project that was just, GPSing, something out there in the wilderness area, yeah, I wouldn't recommend a MRA for that. But if there's something that's collecting plants, or there's something where, yeah, there might be some effect, then I would recommend going through the process.
Yeah, and correct me if I'm wrong here too, I didn't pull up the policy reference, but I think the forest supervisor holds the authority with the Forest Service to approve research requests in wilderness unless there's a prohibited use. At that point, then it would come in to the regional forester level. And at the forest level, then if there's not a prohibited use, remember an MRA can take, a few different forms. It's not a whole MRDG tool. There's lots of other ways to meet that requirement as part of your analysis to determine if you're going to allow that research to happen. It doesn't need to be a full-blown MRDG. It can help, and like Ken put in there, and I think there's some other screening criteria documents to help you walk through a research permit request as well.
Yeah, and Ken also added every agency has policy on this. So yeah, look up your agency's policy on research in wilderness. And then actually Pete Irvine had a great comment in the chat as well. And it sort of harkens back onto this idea is, does it have to happen in wilderness? If you're doing research that can be done outside of wilderness, that's where it should be done, basically. And the researcher should make that strong argument for why he or she is specifically asking to do it within wilderness.
Yeah, and as with any other type of project, there are some that are very simple and straightforward, and others can get very complex, and everything in between. So yeah, sometimes there's not different answers, but different paths to what you're trying to do. So we've got time for a couple more questions. If anyone wants to put it in the chat or just come off mute, feel free. Candace put in the chat, wilderness dependency is a very important filter. And, that's why I guess it's not question one, if that's the description. Well, it's maybe the first question in the MRDG is, can you do this somewhere else? And that's, that's an automatic yes or no question. Yeah, depending on what the monitoring is, as long as there's no actions being taken, Christina, I just saw your chat. Very probably one of those more simple, straightforward ones to work through the process if there is needed, depending on if it's external, if they're going to be going out and collecting data, just talk with the folks on your forest about what needs to be done.
And two, I'll just reinforce part of the purpose of the whole NWSI was to help folks make connections. So, if you have questions about MRA, now you've got 4 people, Dan Morris, myself, John Campbell, Ken Straley, and others to sort of reach out to. You've also been exposed to the WildernessConnect website, which has some great information on it that would probably answer some of your questions.